Hey guys, welcome to Mild Moment History. Tonight you're not in your bed. You're in a muddy trench somewhere between two empires. No one told you which. The banners above your head are torn. The man next to you speaks a language you don't understand. You haven't seen your village in 6 winters. You don't even remember who started the war. They call it holy. They call it justice. But you're here because someone needed bodies. Your boots are soaked. Your hands smell like rust. A bell rings in the distance, not for prayer, but retreat. You don't move. You just breathe. And by the end of tonight's story, you might understand why the greatest wars of the Middle Ages were fought not for glory, but for silence. What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. I read them in the dark. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through forgotten corners of history, maybe light a candle, or subscribe if it helps you feel less alone. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders soften, let the cold slip away, and step softly between the kingdoms. You're not in control, you're in history, and history doesn't care who you fight for. You wake to the sound of dripping. The roof is leaking again, not with rain, but with meltwater, slow, stubborn drops from a frost that refuses to die. Your bed is a board of uneven planks. You call it a bed because it is the only space that is truly yours, though even that is shared with mice and last season's mold. The walls were once painted, but now they wear only time. One plank creaks when the wind hits just right, as if complaining. It does that often. Your breath hangs in the air. You watch it rise and vanish. There's no chimney, only a small slit above the fire pit, and last night's embers gave up long before you did. You pull the blanket tighter. It's rough, not wool, but something coarser smelling of smoke and old straw. It used to be part of a horse's saddlebag, or maybe a monk's robe. You're not sure anymore. You haven't been sure of anything since the empire changed hands. Outside hooves echo, not galloping, just slow, heavy steps. Patrol. You don't move, you know better. Windows bring questions, questions bring pain. And besides, they're not here for you. Not yet. Your fingers ache as you scrape the pot. You're not sure what today's stew is. It was once cabbage, maybe, or turnip skins. Maybe a little bone broth left over from the goat the soldiers borrowed last week. The smell isn't bad. Not good. Just warm. That's all you care about. You break the bread hard and gray. It cracks instead of tears. You soften it in the stew like always, like your mother showed you before the world got noisy. There's no salt, not since the caravan routes changed hands. The last merchant passed through 3 weeks ago, but his horse collapsed in the snow, and the soldiers took the rest. Once you remember eating apples, real apples, crisp red sticky on your fingers. That was before the border moved, before the war had names. Now you eat what stays underground. You chew slow, not because of your teeth, but because it's all there is, and you never know when the next bowl will come. There's a church on the hill. Half stone, half memory. The bell tower is empty now. They melted it down last spring. Said it was for the empire's glory. You wonder if glory sounds like copper. But the chapel door still opens. Sometimes the new priest is there. Not your priest. He came with the soldiers. Speaks like he's translating for someone far away. You nod anyway. You say the words. You kneel. Not for faith, but for peace. Your real prayers are quieter. You whisper them to the fire, or to your boots, or to the frost in the corners of the barn. You pray the wind turns before the soldiers do. You pray the men in metal forget your house. You pray for things to stay small, unnoticed, ordinary. Once you believed in saints, now you believe in not being seen. The birds didn't return this week, not the loud ones. Not the ones that scratch for seeds. Just crows, big ones. They sit on the broken fence posts and stare at the field. They're not hungry yet, but they will be. The air smells like forge smoke, even though no one's forging. You know that smell. It travels faster than soldiers. At night you hear new sounds, not owls, not foxes, boots on dirt, then silence, then horses breathing, not charging, just waiting, like the land itself is holding its breath. The boy from the other side of the stream stopped coming to trade. He had a limp, but he always brought dried fish. You wonder if he crossed the wrong path, or the wrong border, or simply didn't cross at all. The Empire says peace is coming, but peace always walks behind fire. And the wind now comes from the east, the Empire that says it owns you. You wake before the sun rises, not because you want to, not because you're rested, but because something cold has crept beneath your blanket, and your body has learned that dawn is never soft in this place. Your eyes open to fog, not the kind that drifts gently across hills, but the kind that clings to your skin like breath you didn't mean to exhale. The tent around you is sagging. The cloth is stiff with frost. Someone's foot is pressed against your back. You don't turn to see who. You all sleep too close to know where one body ends and another begins. You reach for your boots in the dark. They're still damp from yesterday. You slide them on anyway. The pain is sharp, but sharp means you're still here. Outside, the mud crunches under your step. A few men are already moving, coughing into their sleeves, pulling their coats tighter. No one speaks yet. Words come later. After warmth, after water. After making sure no arrows are waiting behind the tree line. You walk to the edge of camp, not far, just enough to see what the land is doing today. It's empty, as always, wide and wrong and silent. The field beyond the ridge doesn't belong to anyone, at least not anymore. 3 winters ago, your side claimed it for the Empire. 2 summers ago, they claimed it back. Now, no one comes to reclaim it. Only bodies pass through planting footprints where flags used to stand. The road that runs through it has no name. It was called something once, back when this region had a language. But the names have all been swallowed by war. Now you just call it the long path, because that's all it is, long and uncertain, like everything else. You remember maps, vaguely. A man once came through camp with one rolled into a leather case too clean for the world you lived in. He said he was from the capital, said he was making lines for the emperor. You didn't ask which emperor. It didn't matter. Lines never reach this far. They fade before they get here. When you were a child, you thought borders were real. Walls, fences, towers with guards, something solid, something loud, but now you know the truth. Borders are whispers, promises scratched into the dirt by men who've never stood in it. Someone behind you sneezes, then curses, then goes quiet again. You look down at your hands. The gloves are torn. You've sewn them 3 times already, but the seams don't hold anymore. The thread is tired. So are you. You think about home, not because you miss it, but because you're not sure it exists anymore. The Empire told you to leave it, march east, and not ask questions. They gave you a badge and a reason. You lost the badge in the first river crossing. You can't remember the reason. Your stomach growls, but there's nothing to offer it yet. Maybe later the cook will have something hot. Maybe not. It's hard to tell which supply route still belongs to which crown. You sit on a rock. The frost on it soaks through your coat, but you don't mind. Cold keeps the flies away, and silence, if you sit long enough, starts to sound like memory. You watch the fog rise from the earth like breath. You wonder who breathed it last. A scout, a child, a farmer who planted wheat before the soldiers came, someone who once believed that the gods cared about banners. A raven lands nearby, big, black, unbothered. It picks at something in the dirt, then flies off again. You wonder if it recognizes you, if it knows your face by now. A voice calls. Not yours, not your language. One of the new conscripts from the southern province. His accent curls like smoke. He gestures toward the line of trees, says something you don't quite catch. But you understand his eyes. They're asking, "Is today the day we march again?" You shrug, because here, no one knows. Orders come like thunder, loud, sudden, without warning. You pack your life in a sack and move toward the sound. That's the rule. You stand again. Your knees complain. Your back reminds you that the ground is not kind. You stretch just enough to feel the ache pull through your spine. And then, stillness. It's strange, but you've learned to treasure the moments when nothing happens. No horns, no boots, no fire. Just the breath of the earth and the weight of the sky. You don't know where you are. Not exactly. Some say it's the borderlands of the Old Kingdom. Some say it's the outer flank of the Empire's claim, but the truth is simpler. You are where maps end, where names run out and histories blur. Where soldiers sleep in dirt and wake in silence. Where you exist not as a citizen, not as a hero, not even as a pawn. Just a person, breathing, waiting, listening. The first time your village burned, you were still there. You remember the way the sky turned copper, not red, not gold, but something in between, like blood diluted in wine. You were in the barn, hiding behind a barrel of dried hay that hadn't been dry in weeks. The walls shook, not from flames, but from boots. They said they were reclaiming the land, said the old king had stolen it generations ago. You didn't argue, you didn't speak. You just listened to the fire chewing through the chapel roof, heard someone scream, and prayed it wasn't your brother. The fire took the school, the church, the roof of your house. It took the goats too, not with flame, but with fear. They scattered into the woods and never came back. That night you slept in the ashes, not because you were brave, but because there was nowhere else. You covered your face with a cloth soaked in river water, but the smoke still climbed down your throat. When the soldiers left, they said you were free. They left a flag. It was blue and white with a crest no one could name. You hung it from the fence post just to make them leave faster. You rebuilt slowly. The barn first, then the well, then the smallest house, just enough for your mother and sister. You slept under carts. You ate soup made of weeds. You learned how to listen for metal in the wind, how to know if it was the sound of armor or rain. And for a year, the fire stayed gone. The second time your village burned, you were not there. You were 2 valleys east, wearing the colors of the same empire that had once sworn to protect you. You didn't have a choice. The conscription list didn't ask where you were born. It was a traveler who told you, a merchant with hollow eyes and cracked hands. He passed through your camp at dusk looking for someone to trade linen with. You overheard him speaking to the captain. He mentioned the name of your village, but not in the way people do when they speak of homes. He said it like a ruin, a warning. You asked what happened. He didn't answer, just shook his head and said the empire to the west had taken it back, for now. Then he pulled a piece of burnt wood from his pack. Just a splinter carved with a shape you recognized the edge of your grandfather's gate. You sat alone that night, away from the fire, holding that blackened scrap like it was alive. You tried not to imagine the second burning, but your mind did it for you. You saw the church crumble again this time, with no one inside to pray. You saw the well filled with ash. You saw your mother if she had stayed with her back to the door protecting your sister, or maybe running, or maybe already gone. No one wrote it down. No poet etched it in verse. No map recorded the shift. But it happened. Two flags, two empires, one village. Burned twice. Now when people ask where you're from, you don't answer. Not because you've forgotten, but because the name is lighter that way. Easier to carry when no one expects it to still exist. Sometimes in your sleep you hear the goats. Just a faint sound, distant and impossible. You wake, heart-racing hand, reaching for a wall that isn't there. You sit up, breathe slow. The stars look the same here as they did back then. That's something. But the land beneath them, the land that held your home, no longer knows your name. And in the silence that follows, you understand. You weren't from the village. You were from the ashes. The coat wasn't yours. It never was. It didn't fit quite right. The sleeves were too long, the shoulders too wide. When you walked, it flapped like it was trying to run away. But you wore it anyway. You found it on the side of the road 3 days after the frost came early and the fires went out. It lay across a low stone wall, still folded, still warm. Someone had placed it there, not dropped, not forgotten, left on purpose, a gesture, a goodbye. It smelled of pine tar and sweat, and something fainter, something almost sweet, like old soap or dried apples. The kind of smell that didn't belong in war. The kind of smell that made your throat tighten without warning. You picked it up with careful fingers, half expecting it to move, to twitch, to protest. But it didn't. Just sagged in your arms like a sleeping dog. You looked around. Nothing but trees, mud, silence. No body nearby, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Whoever wore it last had vanished gently. That night, you didn't sleep. You just sat by the fire with the coat wrapped around your shoulders and tried to imagine the man who once called it his. He was taller, clearly, stronger, maybe, or just older. You could feel the places where the fabric had molded to someone else's rhythm, the way the elbows bent, the way the collar folded. The small tear near the hip that had been sewn shut with red thread, not black. You wondered what he had seen. Which campfires he sat beside, which orders he followed, which lies he believed. You wondered if he had ever watched a friend die too tired to weep. You wondered if he had looked at his hands one morning and thought, I don't know whose these are anymore. You kept the coat. You wore it every day, through sleet, through hunger, through marches that stretched across entire lifetimes. It became your second skin, but it never became yours. Because when you ran, when the orders changed again, and the flags reversed, and you found yourself in another village with the wrong language and the wrong name, it was the coat they noticed, not your face, not your voice. The coat. They pulled you from the crowd, pointed at the stitching at the insignia, barely visible beneath the dirt. They thought it meant something, that it declared you loyal, or guilty, or both. You tried to explain, not with words, but with your eyes, your hands, your silence. But they didn't care. Cloth doesn't explain. It accuses. They locked you in a barn for 3 days, didn't speak, didn't beat you, just left you alone with the smell of wet hay and the creaking of beams older than your memories. When they let you out, they didn't say why. They didn't return the coat. They handed you another one, smaller, darker, patched at the shoulders. It belonged to someone else, too. Of course it did. Everything here does. Now when you walk, your shoulders hunch differently. The sleeves pull tight when you reach forward. It rubs at the base of your neck, as if reminding you you are borrowed. You are replaceable. You never saw the first coat again. But sometimes, when wind cuts through the trees and you smell pine tar and sweat and something faintly sweet, you look around just in case. Because part of you still believes that man is out there, that he left the coat behind not to escape, but to begin again, that maybe that's all you're doing too. The cold doesn't ask permission. It doesn't knock. It seeps. Tonight, it slips beneath the flaps of your tent like a whisper made of knives. The kind of cold that curls around your bones, not just your skin. The kind that remembers you. You're lying flat on your back, wrapped in everything you own. Shirt coat, even the extra pair of socks that once belonged to someone who doesn't march anymore. Still, it's not enough. The air tastes like iron and smoke. The sky above is black, but not the comforting kind. Not velvet black. This is wet black, empty black. The kind of sky that doesn't bother watching. Someone a few feet away is coughing. Not hard. Just enough to sound like something cracking. You know the sound. It's not sickness. Not yet. Just lungs trying to remember warmth. You roll onto your side, trying to conserve heat. Your hands are tucked under your arms. Your knees are pressed tight against your chest. Your face is hidden beneath the edge of your coat. You've done this before. You've survived worse. Maybe. In the morning there will be frost in your boots, not on in. A layer of ice clinging to the inside like a second lining. You'll still put them on. Of course you will. You'll stamp your feet, bite your tongue. Pretend you don't feel the burning that comes before numbness. The captain told you supplies are coming. He said it like a promise, like the way children promise not to peek during a prayer. You nodded. You always nod. But the truth is, you stopped waiting for wagons weeks ago. The emperor sent no blankets. He sent a letter, a speech, a ribbon to pin on your chest that blew away in the first storm. But warmth, no. They say the capital is beautiful in winter, fire in every hearth, wine spiced with cinnamon, feasts under golden ceilings, men in velvet robes drawing lines on parchment, deciding where you'll freeze next. You close your eyes, pretend you're somewhere else. A farmhouse, straw mattress, a dog curled at your feet, a woman humming while stirring something thick and sweet. You reach for the memory, but it doesn't hold. It's too thin, like your blanket. You think of the man who used to share your tent. Tomas, tall, red scarf. Used to joke that he snored just to keep wolves away. He stopped snoring 3 nights ago. He didn't make a sound, really, just curled tighter and never moved again. When the sun came up, his face was still, peaceful, like he had finally remembered a dream worth keeping. You didn't cry, no one did. You took his boots, his scarf, folded what was left of him into a shallow grave just beyond the tree line, said nothing, covered him with leaves. The ground was too hard to dig properly, but the wind would bury him eventually. That night you tried to sleep with both scarves around your neck. But they didn't help. The cold doesn't care how many scarves you wear, or how many names you remember. The boy on your left is muttering now, something about his mother, maybe her hands, maybe a song. His voice is quiet, fraying. You want to tell him it's okay, that she's probably singing somewhere warm, but you don't lie to people anymore, not out loud. Instead, you shift closer, not much, just enough so your shoulder touches his. It's not much, but it's something. Shared warmth, shared silence, shared pretending, and for a moment it helps. Then the wind changes. You hear it whistle through the trees, through the tents, through the folds of every unspoken fear. Someone curses. Someone else pulls their coat tighter. A few feet away, you hear someone sob into their hands. Not loudly, just once. And it echoes louder than any trumpet. You breathe slowly, in, out, in, out. Count the seconds between each breath. Not because it keeps you calm, but because it keeps you from noticing how cold the air is when it enters your nose. They say this is what loyalty feels like. They say this is the price of empire, but you're not sure who they are. Because here, where the frost bites first and the orders arrive late, you've learned something deeper. The Emperor doesn't know your name. He knows the name of the battle, the name of the road, the name of the border, but not yours. Not Tomas, not the boy beside you, not the man who sleeps with one eye open just in case. You are all numbers. And numbers don't need blankets. No one speaks your language here. Not the boy who sharpens arrows by the fire, not the old man who prays before eating, not the girl who binds wounds with her left hand, quick as breath. You know their names, or the names they go by, but not their words. They speak in fragments, in echoes, in syllables, shaped by mountains you've never seen and rivers you'll never cross. The empire brought you all together, but it didn't bring a translator. At first you tried. You asked for water, bread, directions to the latrine. They stared, smiled, offered nothing but shrugs and soft laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes. So you learned to speak differently. You point, you nod. You mimic the motion of hunger with a hand to your belly, of thirst with your lips parted and your fingers curled like a cup. You discover that pain has a universal shape. A certain way shoulders curl in to how hands cradle ribs, how eyes close not to sleep but to forget. The first time you understood someone fully, it was over a piece of cloth. He held it up, torn, bloodied, and gestured to the hole in his side. You didn't speak, just walked over, knelt, and pressed your hands where his couldn't reach. He didn't flinch, just breathed through his teeth and gave you a look you'll never forget. It wasn't thanks. It wasn't relief. It was recognition, like two strangers passing each other in a storm and realizing the other is wet too. Since then, you've become fluent in silence. A tilt of the head means not yet. A raised brow means be ready. A long exhale means don't ask. You've watched men weep without making a sound. You've watched women bury brothers they never named. You've held hands with someone who couldn't remember their own country, only the smell of its wheat. Around the fire, the unspoken becomes ritual. Someone places a tin bowl in front of you, not because they were told to, but because they saw your hands were empty. You return the gesture the next night, offering a scrap of dried meat you saved from the last ration. No one keeps track, no one says you're welcome, but the balance remains, always. There is a man from the southern marshes who whistles when he's nervous. He doesn't know he does it. It's high-pitched, almost like a bird. The others used to mock him. Now they just know when he whistles danger isn't far. Another man hums before battle. Not a song, just a note, low, repetitive, like a heartbeat made of breath. He says nothing but the hum settles people. You stand closer to him when the sky turns red. The girl with the quick hands once touched your shoulder after a raid. No bandage, no words. Just a hand, firm and brief, like saying, "You're still here." That was the day you realized language is not always about speaking. Sometimes it's about being seen. You've forgotten some of your old words. The ones that once rolled off your tongue like pebbles in a stream, now they catch clumsy and slow. You dream in gestures now. You talk in your sleep, they say, but not in any known tongue. And still you are understood. You speak with your eyes when there's no time to warn. You speak with your footsteps when the path ahead is unsure. You speak with your silence when the grief is too heavy for breath. In this place, between nations, between borders, between kings and stories, you have become something else. A mouth without language, a heart without anthem, a soul fluent only in survival. And tonight, as you share a blanket with three others who don't know your name, as you pass a flask without asking what's inside, as you curl your fingers in the dirt and trace the shape of a home you can no longer remember, you realize something. You've never spoken more clearly than you do right now. The bodies had already cooled when the priests arrived. Not one, not two, a cartful. Stacked carefully with hands folded and eyes closed as if death could be made tidy by symmetry. But you had seen the truth. You had heard the way bones cracked under footfalls. You had seen the flies gathering before the prayers ever began. They came wearing white, cloaks clean, uncreased, trailing just above the bloodstains on the earth. One of them carried incense, another a silver cross. Their faces were blank, not cruel, just distant, like they had never bled for this land, like they'd read about grief but never tasted it. You stood to the side, not out of reverence, just exhaustion. You'd been digging graves since dawn, the kind that are barely holes, the kind where the frost bites first and the dirt breaks like stale bread. Your fingers were cracked, your nails black, the sleeves of your coat stiff with sweat and soil. They didn't look at you when they arrived. They looked at the bodies. Counted them. 1, 2, 7, 13. One of them, the youngest, flinched when he saw the smallest one. A boy, maybe 12, maybe younger, still wearing a leather pouch around his neck. You'd left it on him. Couldn't bring yourself to cut it off. The priests murmured, Latin, maybe, or something meant to sound like it. The words curled into the air and vanished before they reached your ears. You remember thinking, too soft, too clean, too late. No one in your unit said anything. You all stood like statues made of ash, watching, waiting, not for comfort, not for answers. Just for it to be over. When the incense was lit, the smoke stung your eyes more than the wind ever had. It didn't smell like heaven. It smelled like distance, like something meant to cover, not cleanse. You wonder where the priests had come from. A cathedral, perhaps, or a camp near the capital, somewhere with candles and bread, with walls that still held heat. You don't blame them. They weren't here when it happened. They didn't hear the screams, didn't watch the tower fall, didn't feel the breath leave someone's chest beneath their hands. Still, you wish they'd come sooner. Not to save. You know better than that. But to witness. Because the only ones who saw the truth are the ones too broken to tell it. After the final prayer, one of the priests approached you. He offered a small medal, said it was blessed, said it would keep you safe. You didn't take it. Not out of spite, not even disbelief. You just didn't have a pocket left to carry something so small that meant so little. He looked confused, then nodded and moved on to the next man. The sun was beginning to set when they left. Same quiet robes, same distant eyes, as if grief could be boxed and buried and walked away from. You stayed behind, not because you wanted to, because someone had to cover the graves. The snow started falling soon after, light at first, gentle, like even the sky didn't want to disturb the earth. You pressed your hand to one of the mounds, not the child's, a man. You hadn't learned his name, only that he whistled in his sleep. You whispered something, not a prayer, just a word, still. Still breathing, still alive, still remembering, still here. You sat there until the snow erased the outlines of the bodies, until the wind picked up and the others began calling your name, until the night reminded you that the emperor sends no fire and the blankets are few. As you rose, your knees cracked. Your hands ached, But something else lingered, not warmth, not peace. Just a thought. The priest came late. But you had been here all along. They didn't tell you he was a king. Not at first. They just brought the body in a wagon, a rough one with a cracked wheel and a canvas cover stained by blood and something darker. They lowered him gently. No fanfare, no music, just two guards with dull eyes and a priest who looked like he'd forgotten how to kneel. You could tell he was someone. His hands were clean, his boots stitched with gold thread, his sword still sheathed untouched as if he never had to use it. His face was smooth, almost delicate, like it hadn't been shaped by weather or fear. You wondered if he had ever dug a ditch in his life. They said he'd died in the night, heart failure, or poison, or God's will. No one agreed, no one cared, not here, not anymore. The captain pointed at you. Dig. No speech, no explanation, just the motion of a finger like drawing a line in dirt. You didn't ask who the man was. You didn't ask why it had to be you. You just picked up the spade. The ground was soft that morning, not frozen, not wet, just loose enough to yield, like even the earth knew it was time to let go. You dug slowly, not out of laziness, out of something else, something quieter, a kind of reverence that didn't come from belief, but from repetition. You dug for soldiers, for deserters, for strangers. But this was different. This was someone who once wore a crown. When the hole was done, you sat beside it. You didn't look at the body, not directly, but you watched the guards whisper to one another, saw how they didn't touch him, how they avoided his eyes even in death. As if guilt might still be contagious. One of them muttered a name. You didn't catch it. It didn't matter. A name means little when it's buried deeper than the man who carried it. The priest stepped forward, said a few words, Latin again, distant, hollow. The wind carried them away before they could land. You stood up, took the man's shoulders, felt how light he was, lighter than a king should be. As you lowered him into the earth, your hands brushed the gold trim on his coat. It glinted once in the morning sun, then disappeared into shadow. No cheers, no mourning. Just a shuffle of boots and a cough. The grave swallowed him gently. You covered him with dirt as the sky turned gray, each shovelful quieter than the last. The final one made no sound at all. When it was done, no one marked the spot. No stone, no flag, not even a cross. The captain said he wasn't our king, said we were only passing through. You stayed behind as the others left, not for duty, just for a moment. You looked at the fresh mound, at the dent in the earth where power once lay, and you wondered, what does it mean to be king? Is it gold on your chest, a horse at your command, 1,000 men ready to die for you? Or is it this a hole in forgotten soil dug by hands that never swore allegiance? You whispered something, not to him, to the dirt. Rest, not because he deserved it, but because someone had to say it. You noticed him first because of the way he held his pack, like it was heavier than it should have been. Not just with supplies, with something else, something that made his shoulders lean slightly to the left, like he was always bracing for a blow. He came into camp on a rainy morning, soaked through, eyes darting like a cornered fox. His coat didn't match. One sleeve carried the colors of your side. The other didn't. No one said anything. Not at first. There are rules, but there are also silences. And in wartime, silence often comes before violence. He told the quartermaster his name, simple, common, a name that could belong to anyone. He said he had defected, said he was done fighting for the wrong side, said the empire lied. You didn't believe him. No one did. But no one turned him away either. You needed numbers, warm bodies, hands that could hold a shovel or a sword. So he stayed. He didn't speak much, slept near the edge of camp, ate only when offered, kept to himself, even in the cold. But he always carried two flags. One sewn into the lining of his coat, your flag, the one that earned him a place by the fire, and one folded deep in his pack, the old one, the one he never showed, but never burned. You saw it once, late, when he thought no one was watching. He pulled it out slowly, like it might shatter, ran his fingers over the fabric, kissed the corner, then tucked it away again. You wanted to ask why he kept it, why he didn't tear it apart, why he hadn't chosen. But you didn't, because you knew the answer. Some loyalties don't die. They just wait, quietly, like a wound beneath cloth. One night, a rumor started. Someone said he'd been spotted near the supply wagons, said he'd been whispering to someone on the road, said he still wore his old crest beneath his shirt. The captain called him forward, asked nothing, just stared. He stared back. Not defiant, not scared, just tired. Then he knelt. No orders, no command. He dropped to his knees in the mud and said only this: I wanted to belong. That was all. They didn't kill him. They just stopped seeing him. No more greetings, no more shared rations, no fire at night. You were the last one to speak to him. He sat by the edge of the woods, tying string around his boot. His fingers trembled. The scarf he wore had a hole in it, patched not well. You asked if he needed anything. He shook his head, then looked at you, really looked, and said it's hard to know where you're from, when everywhere you go someone tells you it's wrong. That night he was gone. No trace, no blood, no fight, no flag. Just a small piece of cloth near his tent, torn from his coat. Half of your flag, half of his. You took it. Folded it, wrapped it around your wrist, not to honor him, not to remember, but to carry the question he left behind. What do you do with a man who tried to belong to both sides and ended up belonging to none? You found it buried in the bottom of someone else's satchel, a lump of soap barely bigger than a walnut, wrapped in worn cloth tied with string. It fell out when they turned the bag upside down, looking for a flint. They didn't notice, or maybe they didn't care. You picked it up quietly, almost afraid it would crumble. It was pay, off-white, the kind of color that reminded you of sheets drying in spring wind before everything turned gray. You didn't expect the scent. It was faint at first, then stronger. Not perfume, not flowers, something older, something gentler, like wood shavings on a warm floor, like the inside of your mother's apron, like the drawer where you used to hide things you didn't want to forget. You held it to your nose and forgot the camp. Forgot the smoke, the mold, the wet wool and rotting bread. For a moment, you were standing in your old kitchen again, bare feet on cold stone, morning light through thin curtains, steam rising from a copper pot, your sister humming. You didn't cry. You don't do that anymore. But something in your chest shifted, softened. You wrapped the soap again, carefully, as if it might vanish. You didn't ask who it belonged to. If they hadn't missed it by now, they never would. Or maybe they'd forgotten what it meant. You kept it with you, not to use, but to remember. That night, you pressed it to your chest as you fell asleep. Not close to your face. You didn't want to lose the scent too quickly. Just near your ribs, like an extra heartbeat. In the morning, the air smelled like horses and ash again, but the memory lingered. One of the younger boys asked what you were holding. You didn't answer, just shook your head and tucked it deeper into your coat. Later, someone offered you real soap, a rough bar made of animal fat, and lye good for scouring skin raw. You said no. You already had some. They laughed, thought you were joking. You weren't. You carried that soap for weeks, through sleet, through marches, through days when your hands bled from holding a shovel too long. When your fingers ached, you touched the cloth around it. When your stomach turned from spoiled broth, you sniffed the edge just once. It became your talisman. Not against death, not against pain, just against forgetting. Because the longer you marched, the more faces you lost, the more words you misplaced, the more you looked into the fire and didn't recognize your own thoughts. But the scent stayed. On the worst night, when frost crept into the seams of the tents and two men froze before morning, you shared it. Not openly, not like rations. You simply passed the cloth to the man next to you and watched his eyes change. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. You both understood. It wasn't soap. It was memory. And in this place, memory was the last thing that smelled clean. You never learned where it came from. Which town, which hands, which shop on which forgotten street. But in a war where everything rotted, food flags, faith, that little lump of soap reminded you. Once you were a child, and children remember scents longer than names. It wandered into camp at dusk. No saddle, no reins, just a thin leather strap around its neck, frayed at both ends. Its coat was mottled, once chestnut, now streaked with dried mud and pale patches where the hair had fallen out. A single scar ran along its left flank, long and deliberate, like a knife had traced it with purpose. You were the first to see it, standing near the fire, rubbing warmth into your hands when you felt its eyes on you. It didn't move, just watched, like it was trying to decide if you were safe or familiar. The others noticed next. Voices lowered, boots shifted, some reached for rope, some for rifles, but no one stepped forward. There was something about it, the way it held still in the orange glow steam, rising faintly from its nostrils. Not wild, not tame, just free. Someone whispered, "Whose is it?" Someone else said, "Ours now," but no one moved. You took a step, not fast, slow enough to let it leave if it wanted. It didn't. You raised a hand. It flinched, but stayed. You lowered it again. The mark on its flank wasn't yours, not your empire, not your enemies either. A third crest, old, faded, forgotten, one of the kingdoms that no longer claimed maps. You offered it a crust of bread. It sniffed, then turned away. It didn't want food. It wanted space. That night, it stayed at the edge of camp, near the trees, head bowed, breathing quiet. No rope was tied. No one dared. In the morning, it was still there. You brought water in a tin pan. It drank slowly, then walked to a patch of grass, yellow and frostbitten, and grazed without looking at you again. By noon, soldiers began whispering. Maybe it's cursed. Maybe it's a sign. Maybe it carries news. You didn't answer, because you weren't sure either. But part of you believed it had seen something. Maybe a battlefield. Maybe a burning village. Maybe the death of the man who used to ride it. And maybe when the shouting ended, when the blood dried, when the flags fell, it had simply walked away, refused to pick a side. You envied it. That evening, it followed you. Not closely, not like a pet, just a quiet companion, a presence that neither demanded nor fled. You didn't name it. Names felt too heavy, too human, too full of expectations. Instead, you spoke to it in thoughts. You're the smartest one here, you thought. You ran when we stayed. You chose when we obeyed. That night, as the frost crept in and the fire cracked low, someone tried to tie a rope around its neck. It reared. Not high, not wild, just enough to snap the rope and knock the man to the ground. Then it bolted, not far, just to the tree line. Then it stopped, turned, watched. As if to say, I remember. The man swore, raised his fist, but didn't chase. You didn't speak. You just walked to the place where it had stood and knelt down. There in the soft mud, its hoofprint remained clear, round, perfect. You traced it with your finger, then stood. The next morning it was gone. Some said it had returned to the mountains. Others said it had been shot in the woods by another patrol. But you knew better. It had left, quietly. Like freedom always does. It wasn't a church anymore. Not really. The walls still stood mostly, stone blocks weathered and cracked, leaning against time. One side had collapsed the eastern wall where the sun used to rise through stained glass. But the glass was gone. So were the benches. So was the roof. What remained was silence, and dust, and the faintest scent of burned wood like a prayer that had never finished. You arrived at dusk. The village had emptied long ago. No doors on the houses, no fires, just bare thresholds and windswept floors. Someone pointed at the structure on the hill and said, "We'll sleep there. The stones will block the wind." You followed. The steps were uneven. Moss crept between the cracks. A vine curled up the old bell tower, but the bell itself was missing, stolen, or melted. No one knew. Inside, the air was different. Colder, yes, but also still. Like the space had learned to listen after all its songs were gone. You laid your pack on the stone floor. Not soft, but flat. You'd slept on worse. Overhead, the sky gaped open stars blinking through ribs of broken timber. You traced their outlines without lifting your head. One looked like a cross, one like a doorway, one like nothing at all. You weren't alone. 3 others shared the space, curled in opposite corners, wrapped in cloaks that smelled of ash and old wool. No one spoke. You all understood. The walls were thin even when made of stone. There were still carvings on one of them. Not words, just shapes. A hand raised toward a circle. A fish, a lamb. You didn't know what they meant, but they felt patient. Like they'd seen centuries, watched wars come and go, and decided not to flinch. You curled into your coat arms around your knees. The stone was hard against your hip. You didn't care. Above you, an owl moved across the sky, silent as breath. You closed your eyes. And for the first time in weeks, you slept without dreaming of fire. Morning came with blue light and frost. One of the others stirred, muttering in a language you didn't know. You nodded at him. He nodded back. Neither of you mentioned how well you slept. You stepped outside and looked back once. The church stood the same as you'd found it, crumbled, crooked, empty. But not dead. Nothing that holds sleep so gently can ever be fully gone. They said it was justice. That's what the captain called it. That's what the priest whispered before stepping aside. That's what the others muttered under their breath as they gathered in the square. You didn't speak. You watched the man kneel. His hands weren't tied. His face wasn't covered. He had walked there on his own boots, heavy in the morning mud, as if each step carried a weight no one else could feel. They said he had stolen food, a loaf of bread, a heel of cheese, a dried apple found in the bottom of a soldier's pack. They said he'd lied, said he'd eaten alone while others starved. You weren't sure if it was true. You weren't sure if anyone was. But that didn't matter. The sentence had already been spoken. He knelt by the platform. A pile of stones lay beside him. Not sharp, not large, just enough. The captain handed the first one to the youngest among you, a boy with trembling fingers and eyes that darted like birds. The boy didn't throw. He dropped it. It bounced once, rolled, stopped. The next stone came faster, and the next, and the next. You didn't move. Your hands stayed inside your coat, your boots rooted to the ground. You told yourself you were tired. You told yourself someone else would do it. You told yourself it was already done. But in your chest, something hollow stirred. The man didn't cry out, didn't raise his arms, didn't beg. He just watched the sky blinking slowly, like he was waiting for it to rain. When the final stone fell, the captain nodded. 2 men dragged the body away. No words, no prayer, no name spoken. The square emptied. Boots shuffled, voices lowered, campfires lit. The air moved on as if nothing had happened. But the pile of stones remained. You passed it later, walking toward the water barrel. It looked ordinary. No blood, no mark, just a mound. But it held something, not guilt, not anger, something quieter. Wait. You picked up one stone. Just for a second. It was smooth, cold, like any other. You set it back down. That night you dreamed of bread. Not warm, not fresh, just stolen. And a voice maybe yours asking, what do we call justice when it makes us all smaller? It started with one flame. Someone had lit it the night after the worst of the rain, when boots were still soaked and tempers were low, when 2 tents had collapsed and the stew was more water than warmth. You don't know who it was, no one ever said. But when the sun slipped beneath the tree line and the sky turned the color of wet iron, there it was. A candle, short, bent, wedged into the hollow of a helmet turned upside down, its wax already melted down one side, forming a crooked white river. You hadn't seen a flame like that in weeks, not one that burned for no reason. Not one that wasn't trying to cook or warn or signal. This one just glowed. Someone placed it near the center of camp on a flat stone between logs. Not protected, not hidden, just there. And it stayed. Through the night, through the wind, through the shuffle of boots and the rustle of blankets. You watched it. You weren't the only one. Eyes kept drifting toward it, not staring, just glancing, as if checking to make sure it hadn't gone out. The next night, it was there again. New candle, new wax, same spot. You didn't ask who brought it. You didn't want to know. Knowing might make it a rule, might make it a command, might break the spell, so you just let it be. Each night, someone lit it, not at the same time, not with a speech, just quietly. A match, a breath, a flicker, and then silence. No one sat too close, but no one let it die. One evening, a recruit knocked it over by accident. His arm caught the helmet. The candle rolled, the flame hissed. Before the wax could harden, 3 hands moved at once. Upright, relit, recentered. No shouting, no scolding. Just the quiet urgency of something sacred. Later, someone placed small stones around it at a circle, like a tiny wall. not to keep things out, just to say this matters. The candle became a rhythm. On nights when gunshots echoed across the hills, it still burned. On nights when men limped back from patrol with blood on their sleeves, it still burned. On nights when no one spoke, when the air was too thick with remembering, it still burned. You came to believe it had a will, that maybe it survived not because you protected it, but because it chose to. As if the flame itself knew what it meant to you all. A signal, a witness, a soft refusal to go dark. One night, after digging a shallow grave, you sat near it for the first time, close enough to feel the heat, close enough to see how the wax pooled and stilled. You didn't speak, you just watched. The flame swayed once like it was listening. And you whispered, "Stay!" That was all. The next morning, it was gone. No candle, no wax, no helmet, just the stones. And in the center, a new thing, a single feather, gray, curled at the edge, resting exactly where the flame had been. You didn't ask, you didn't move it. You just nodded once to the stone, to the memory, to the wind. And walked on. Because some lights don't go out, they just change shape. No one knew where he came from. He wasn't part of any unit, didn't wear a uniform, carried no badge, no crest, no rank. He just appeared one morning beside the supply wagon, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands already stained with something dark and drying. Someone had been wounded, a gash across the thigh, torn open by a misplaced blade, blood everywhere. The medic was gone. The captain was shouting. And then he stepped forward. No questions, no hesitation. He knelt beside the boy, touched the edge of the wound, and said nothing. His fingers moved like they remembered things his mouth had forgotten. Fast, clean, unafraid. You stood nearby watching. He asked for nothing. Someone handed him a needle, someone else thread. He took both without a glance and stitched. 12 passes, neat, even. Then he leaned back, tied the knot, and walked away. That was the first time. After that, he was just there. Whenever someone fell, whenever someone screamed, whenever blood hit the ground in a way that meant more than bruises. He had no tent, no cot. He slept where he worked, curled in the shadow of broken wagons beside barrels of salted meat, under the edge of old canvas. He never spoke unless asked, and even then only what was needed. Hold this, bite down, breathe. Some said he'd once been a surgeon in the capital. Others said he was a deserter, a ghost, a man who'd lost too much to care about sides. You didn't ask, because what mattered wasn't where he came from, but what he did. You remembered the night he stitched your arm. A shallow cut, a lucky one, but deep enough to bleed for hours. You'd wrapped it yourself badly, too tight, too messy. He found you sitting near the fire, clutching it with both hands. He said nothing, just knelt, unwrapped the cloth, washed the wound with something that burned, and began to sew. You watched his hands. They didn't shake. The needle pierced your skin like it belonged there, as if he was sewing shut a story you no longer wanted told. It hurt. Of course it did. But his touch was careful, not soft, precise. When he was done, he patted your wrist once, just once, then moved on. You didn't even catch his eyes, but you felt seen. Later, you left a piece of dried fruit where he slept. He never mentioned it, but the next night you found a new bandage folded neatly beside your boots. That became your language. No thanks, no names, just quiet exchanges. A heel of bread, a stitched up coat, a clean rag when your hands were too dirty to tie one. Sometimes, during battle, you'd look for him, not as a medic, as a marker. If he was still walking, still sewing, still muttering into wounds, then the world hadn't ended yet. Once you saw him break, it was a child, too small, too still. He tried, you saw him try. Pressed, breathed, whispered, waited. But the breath never came back. He closed the child's eyes with 2 fingers, slow and gentle. Then he stood and walked away from camp for a long time. No one followed. When he returned, he looked the same, but something in him had curled inward. You never saw him cry, but that night his hands moved slower, as if each stitch was a goodbye. You still don't know his name. Maybe he had one once. Maybe he gave it away. Maybe it was buried with someone he couldn't save. But in your memory, he remains whole. Not a soldier, not a hero, just a man with quiet hands who met pain without fear, and who taught you that healing doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it just comes with thread. They gave it to you on your first day, dropped it into your hands like a gift or a burden. It was too big. You tried to adjust the strap, but it slipped. You stuffed cloth beneath the rim, but it wobbled when you ran. The metal was dented at the crown like someone had struck it hard and lost. You didn't ask for a new one. There weren't any. The quartermaster shrugged and said, better too big than too small. You wore it anyway, because in this place, protection was a matter of symbol, not function. The helmet didn't keep out the cold. It didn't soften the screams. It didn't save the man beside you last week. But it made you a shape, a silhouette in a line of others. Uniform, unquestioned, forgettable. You learned to tilt your head when you walked just slightly forward to keep it from falling over your eyes. It bruised your nose once, cut your brow in the rain, but you kept it on. Because without it, you were just someone trying not to die. With it, you were something else, part of the march, part of the noise. You noticed the looks. How some soldiers smirked when they saw the rim bounce with every step, how others offered to swap as a joke. You smiled, pretended, laughed when they did, but you never gave it up. Because this helmet, ill-fitting and wrong, became yours in ways nothing else could. It didn't ask who you were. It didn't care where you came from. It didn't pretend to belong. It just stayed. You began to mark it, not with paint or symbols, but with scratches, each one a memory. A hill climbed, a friend lost, a night survived in the frost. Tiny lines on the inside, brim hidden from sight, but known to your fingers. Once during a storm, the wind caught you hard. You stumbled, fell rolled down a slope of wet leaves and forgotten bones. When you came to a stop, your helmet had come off. You crawled through the dark to find it, hands bleeding, mouth full of mud. You found it upside down collecting rain. You emptied it, put it back on, and whispered, still mine. That night you dreamed of home, but in the dream no one recognized you. Not your sister, not your dog, not even the mirror. Because you were wearing the helmet, and no one could see your face. You woke before dawn, didn't speak for hours. Later, someone offered you a better one, fit perfectly, smooth, untouched. You thanked them, tried it on, then handed it back. It wasn't heavy enough, wasn't scratched, didn't smell like smoke and rain and memory. It wasn't yours. Because some things, even the wrong ones, grow into you. and you learn to carry their weight like a second name. It began one night when the fire was low and no one wanted to speak. You were sitting on a log boots, steaming faintly from the frost hands, cupped around a tin cup that had long since gone cold. Then, quietly, someone started to sing. You didn't see who at first. The voice came from the edge of the circle, soft, untrained, worn. Not in your language, not in any you recognized. The words curled like smoke, slow and rising, then dipping again, almost shy. The melody was strange, not quite sad, not quite soothing. Just real. You didn't understand a word. But something in your chest paused. Your breath, your grip, your ache. You looked up. It was the man from the eastern hills, the one who never spoke unless ordered, who carved patterns into wood scraps with the tip of his knife. He sat with his eyes closed back straight, as if the song had remembered him before he remembered it. No one interrupted. Not the captain, not the boys who joked too loudly, not the ones already drifting into sleep. Because this wasn't performance, it was offering. The kind that doesn't ask for applause, only space. The flames flickered in time with the notes. Someone's hand stilled mid-motion. Someone else turned their face toward the dark, letting the sound carry what they couldn't say. And still, you didn't understand. Not the meaning, not the story, not the place it came from, but the shape of it. That was familiar. You'd heard that shape in your mother's hum when she rocked your baby brother. You'd heard it in the wind against your childhood roof. You'd heard it in the hush that follows grief, the part where no one knows what to say, so they don't. When the song ended, no one spoke. The man opened his eyes, blinked once, then stood and walked away into the shadow of the tents. You didn't stop him, didn't ask what the words meant, didn't need to, because something in you had shifted. A knot loosened, a thread pulled, a silence broken without sound. You fell asleep that night with the melody still echoing inside you. Not the words those slipped away, but the rhythm, the rise, the fall. You woke before dawn and found yourself humming. Just one note, low, uncertain, but it was enough. That day, the wind didn't feel as sharp. That night, you sat a little closer to the fire. And though the man never sang again, others began to hum. Soft, mismatched melodies. In their own tongues, to no one in particular. And suddenly, the camp wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't loud either, just full of breath and sound and a strange new language. One made of songs you couldn't translate, but could still understand. It stood at the edge of the field, tall, still, patient. A tree, older than the war, older than the road that wound past it, maybe older than the village that used to stand nearby. You noticed it the first day you arrived. Its branches were thick and low like arms folded across its chest. Its bark split in deep grooves, not from disease, but from time. It didn't move in the wind. It didn't drop leaves when it rained. It didn't bend when soldiers marched past. It simply watched. You passed it every day, going to fetch water, digging latrines, chopping wood. Coming back from patrol boots, heavy hands, numb. Always there, always watching. They chose that tree for the execution. No reason given, no ceremony, just a rope, a name, a time. You didn't know the man. He was caught stealing rations, or so they said. Some believed it, some didn't, but the sentence was the same. He didn't struggle, didn't beg. He stood beneath the branch, eyes open, looking not at the crowd but at the tree. You stood in the back, not to avoid the view, to avoid being seen. You told yourself you had no choice, that orders were orders, that silence was safety. But when the rope tightened, when his feet stopped finding ground, you looked away, at the tree. And you wondered how many had it seen, how many names had it swallowed into its rings. That night the air felt heavier, not with grief, not with guilt, with memory. The next morning, no one mentioned it. Not the captain, not the priest, not the cook who salted the meat with shaking hands. But the tree remained. Now you couldn't walk past without glancing up. The rope was gone, but the branch was marked the way skin stays pale after pressure, a dent, a whisper, a wound. You saw someone leave bread at its roots. Another tied a strip of cloth to a lower limb. No words, just gestures. As if asking the tree to remember because no one else would. You started doing it too. Not openly, not every day, but sometimes when no one was watching, you'd press your hand to its bark. Just for a second. It was cold, rough, alive. You never spoke to it, but you listened. When the wind passed through its leaves, it sounded different. Not like song, not like warning. Like witness. It didn't judge. It didn't forgive. It just stood, holding what no one else dared carry. And somehow that was enough. You didn't know his name. You'd marched beside him for weeks, maybe months, trading shifts on night watch, standing together in the rain, nodding when your eyes met across the fire. But names weren't always shared, not because of secrecy, because of survival. The less you knew, the less you could lose. He was quiet, tall, moved with the stiffness of someone who'd once carried pride in his back. He had a scar across his neck, a pale line that caught the light when he turned his head. You once offered him a piece of salted meat. He took it with a nod, tore it in half, and gave part back. That was the whole conversation. Then one day he didn't return from patrol. No warning, no cry, just gone. They found his body at the edge of the woods. No blood, no struggle, just stillness. Like he'd sat down to rest and the forest never let him get back up. You were one of the ones assigned to search his things. A routine. Check for maps, for orders, for anything worth keeping. His pack was heavier than expected. Inside a water flask, a tin comb, a broken tooth on a string, and at the bottom, wrapped in a wool cloth, a doll. Small, worn, made of straw and thread. Its face was painted with the simplest strokes, 2 dots for eyes, a line for a mouth. The hair was yarn faded red. One arm had been restitched with different fabric blue where the rest was brown. You stared at it for a long time. Someone beside you muttered, "Strange." You didn't answer, because in that moment the war fell away, and what remained was a man with a child, a memory, a promise, or maybe just something that reminded him who he once was. You held the doll carefully, not as evidence, not as property. As something sacred. You didn't ask what to do with it, didn't turn it in, didn't show the captain. That night, when the sky was quiet and the wind had forgotten your name, you placed the doll beneath your blanket, beside your ribs. It stayed warm against your skin. You thought of its story, not the man's, but the doll's. Where it had been, what hands had sewn it, what tears it had dried, what voice had once sung it to sleep. You didn't dream that night. But when you woke, your chest felt less hollow. The next day, you carried it in your coat. Not to hide it, to keep it close. And when the road grew long, when the frost came back, when the silence got too loud, you reached in and held it and remembered. Even here, even now, someone once loved. It didn't happen all at once. You didn't wake up one morning and feel peaceful. You didn't take a deep breath and decide to forgive the world. It faded bit by bit, like heat leaving a stone after sundown. The first time you noticed it was when the stew burned again. The boy stirring it had fallen asleep. You could smell the blackened crust clinging to the bottom of the pot. Someone cursed. Someone kicked the ladle across the mud. You just sat there, watching the steam rise, not tasting it, not caring. Once, you would have shouted, or at least muttered. Anger used to live in your jaw, in the clench of your hands. Now it was gone. You forgot how to shape the words. Later, a man pushed you in the ration line hard enough to make you stumble. You caught yourself, brushed the dirt from your sleeve, didn't look back. He waited, half expecting something, a shove, a glare, a name. You offered none, and he turned away confused. That night, as you lay beneath the torn canvas listening to someone weep into their coat, you tried to summon it, that old fire, the thing that had once burned behind your ribs. You remembered your brother's death, the theft of your family's land, the lie that brought you here. But the spark wouldn't come, just the dull echo of memory, quiet faded like footfalls on snow. Once you believed anger was survival, that fury kept you sharp, that fire meant life. Now you weren't so sure. Anger needed fuel, and you were tired of feeding it. The next day, a commander gave the wrong order, sent 3 men to the wrong ridge. 1 didn't return. No apology, just silence. You watched the commander eat later that night, meat thick and red juice dripping from his fingers. You didn't flinch. Didn't curse. Didn't dream of revenge. You just turned away, not because you'd forgiven him, but because the space inside you that once held rage was now filled with something else. Stillness, cold and wide, like a field after harvest. Sometimes you wonder if it's better this way. To be empty of fire, to be too tired for fury, to live without clenched fists. You miss it a little. The heat, the clarity, but not the aftermath. Not the shaking, not the broken knuckles, not the guilt. Now when someone snaps at you, you blink. When someone lies, you nod. You've become a mirror, reflecting only what others bring. And still you survive, still breathing, still marching, still watching the sky. Some would say you've grown soft, but you know the truth. You didn't lose your anger, you buried it. And in its place, you built something quieter, not peace. Just endurance. It wasn't made of wood, or metal, or even cloth. The mask they made you wear wasn't something you tied behind your head or fastened with buckles. It was words, orders, looks, a silence so thick it left no room for your face. It started when they changed your name, not legally, not in ink, just in tone. You, soldier, number 3, boy with the quiet eyes. They didn't want your story, only your obedience. So you nodded, and they smiled. The next part came easier, a new accent, new posture, the way your boots struck the earth, just so. You watched how the others walked, how they answered questions with fewer words. You learned which expressions were safe. Eyes down, jaw tight, Smile only when others do. And when the captain told you to speak for the patrol because your voice sounded less foreign, you said yes. Even though the words scratched your throat, even though you weren't sure who you were mimicking anymore, you wore the mask well. They began to trust you, let you carry messages, guard the prisoners, lead songs you didn't believe in. And with each task, the mask sank deeper. You stopped correcting people when they got your village wrong. You stopped mentioning your sister's name. You stopped dreaming in your own language. One night, you looked into a bucket of still water and couldn't place the face that looked back. It had your eyes, but not your gaze. It had your lips, but not your silence. It blinked when you blinked but felt far away. The mask worked. Too well. When you tried to speak your truth to a new recruit, he stared at you blankly. Said, "But I thought you were one of them." You laughed. So did he. But the sound didn't reach your chest. Later, you sat by yourself and whispered your real name. Just once, soft, like brushing dust from a shelf, like checking if a window still opens. It felt strange on your tongue, foreign, like a song you used to hum but can't find the melody for anymore. You didn't try again. Because out here, names didn't keep you warm, and truth didn't keep you alive. So you wore the mask. Each day, each march, each meal, until even you started to forget what lived beneath it. But sometimes at night, when the others snored and the fire burned low, you touched your face, not to check for dirt, but to remember that it was still there, that beneath the mask, you still existed. No one draws your village on maps anymore. Not because it burned, though it did. Not because it fell, though it did that too. But because it slipped. Out of memory. Out of language. Out of the stories people tell when the fires burn low, and someone asks, "Where are you from?" You used to answer. Used to speak the name like a stone warmed by the sun. But now, when someone asks you, pause, tilt your head, and say something vague. Near the border, north of the ridge, west of what used to be the capital. They nod. That's enough. No one wants details, just coordinates for ghosts. Once a man with a rolled map asked to see your home. He wore gloves, had clean boots, and smelled like paper. He unrolled the parchment on a crate and tapped with a pale finger. "Here," he asked. "You looked?" It was all lines, curved, cracked, faded. You found the river bend, the cluster of trees that once hid the well, but where your village should have been, there was only blankness, a pale void. Not erased, not overwritten, just forgotten. You didn't answer. The man didn't wait. He rolled the map back up, nodded once and walked away. You stood there a long time. Not sad, just empty. Like the map. That night, you dreamt of your village. Not how it died, but how it lived. You saw the color of the shutters, the sound the gate made when the wind caught it just right, the field where the dogs used to chase shadows at dusk. You woke with your hand reaching for the shape of a door that wasn't there. The camp stirred around you. Footsteps, voices, smoke curling into pale morning light, and you realized the hole on the map wasn't an error. It was a mercy. Because what isn't drawn can't be targeted. What isn't named can't be summoned to die again. So now, when you walk, when you sleep, when you think of the place where your story began, you picture not a dot, not a road, not even a name, but a quiet shape on old paper white as ash, waiting to be remembered only by you. Even when your body rests, your feet don't. You still feel the rhythm. Left, right, left. Boot against mud, stone beneath heel. The breath-timed sway of shoulders and weight. It follows you into sleep. You close your eyes expecting quiet, but your legs twitch. Your spine stiffens. Your jaw clenches against wind that isn't there. You dream of paths, endless ones, cut through hills and forests through villages that blur into one another, names lost, faces forgotten. Sometimes in your dreams you hear someone calling, a voice from behind, or ahead, or inside you. You don't stop, you just keep walking. Because the voice doesn't ask you to turn. It just reminds you you're not home. You haven't been home in years. Maybe longer. You forget what home felt like. Not the place, the act of stopping, of staying, of choosing not to go. Now even when you rest your head against a coat rolled into a pillow, even when the fire warms your cheek and your boots lie by the tent door, you march. Your heartbeat has become the drum. Your dreams the command. Your sleep a road that folds into itself again and again with no arrival. Sometimes you wake with your knees drawn tight, arms pumping like you've been sprinting in place. You look around the fire, the dark, the others still breathing beside you. No one sees, no one stirs. But your body knows you never stopped. Once during a late patrol, you asked the man beside you if he ever dreamed of standing still. He laughed, said no one remembers standing, and kept walking. The memory of the road is deeper than pain, deeper than fear. It's in your bones now. You could close your eyes and still find the slope of the ridge, the bend near the river, the sound your foot makes when it crushes old leaves. And so you march, even in your sleep. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just forward. Because to stop would be to feel everything, and the body has learned that motion dulls the ache. Someday the war will end, you know this. The flags will fall, the orders will fade, the maps will change. But long after the horns have silenced, long after your boots have been burned for kindling, you'll lie in a quiet bed, in a house that doesn't creak beneath gunfire, and you'll close your eyes. And march, still. Softly, because some journeys never end. Not in the waking world, not in dreams, just in the space between. Where sleep becomes memory, and memory becomes motion, and motion becomes you. It happens slowly, not with a blow, not with a shout, just over time. He stopped pointing. At first, when people asked where he was from, he'd lift a hand, north, over those hills, beyond the river with the stone bridge, past the orchard. He had a story then, short, practiced, smooth. His mouth remembered even when his heart forgot. But after the third campaign, the river names blurred. After the fifth, the bridges collapsed, and the orchard burned. Or was it never real? You saw it first one morning. He stood at a crossroads, staring in every direction like they all led backward. Someone joked, "You lost." He didn't answer, just squinted like the world had shifted. That night, he whispered, "I don't know if I'd recognize it, even if I stood in it." You knew what he meant, because home wasn't a place anymore. It was a direction, a dream, a question you asked yourself in silence and answered with a shrug. You remember how he tried, though. He drew maps in the dirt. Lines, arrows, trees, a little square for the house, a curve for the road, dots for wells. But the shapes kept changing. One day the river ran east, the next it vanished entirely. He looked up at you once and said maybe it never existed. You didn't argue, because in war, memory lies not out of malice, but mercy. He carried a stone in his coat pocket, flat, round. He said it came from the wall behind his home. Said it used to rattle when the goats passed by. You held it once. It was warm from his hand, heavy, real. But was it from there? Was there ever a wall? Or was the stone the only part he could carry, so it became everything? One morning he pointed west. Said, I think that's the way. You followed. For 3 days, through mud, through snow. Then when you asked again, he paused, turned in a slow circle, and said nothing. Not because he was confused, but because the question had stopped mattering. You stopped asking after that. He still looked now and then at birds, at clouds, at slopes in the distance, but never with longing. Just a quiet hope that wherever he was going, it wouldn't feel worse than where he'd been. You think that's what home becomes after a certain point. Not a place, not a direction, just a feeling you almost recognize. Like a voice calling from inside a dream, and the further you march, the more you wonder. If you ever found it again, would it still let you in? You don't remember the day of the week. Maybe it was a Thursday. Maybe the last Thursday of a month you never finished. But you remember the cold. You remember the wind slicing through your coat like it knew where to hurt you most. And you remember the emptiness inside your body, not just hunger, but something hollower, something that had forgotten what warmth even meant. You hadn't eaten in 2 days, or maybe 3. There were no rations left. The wagons hadn't arrived. The cooks had stopped pretending to stir the pots. Your legs shook when you stood. Your hands fumbled with buckles that once felt like second nature. The world blurred, at the edges white, then gray, then white again. A snowfall behind your eyes. And then you smelled it. Not strong, not sweet, but real. A curl of steam. A scent that wasn't mud or boots or gun oil. It came from the edge of camp. You followed it, not with purpose, just instinct, like a moth chasing warmth. He was sitting by himself, a man you didn't know well, thin, quiet, had a limp in his left leg, always kept his scarf tied too tightly. In front of him, a tin pot bubbling over a tiny flame. The smell onion, something root-like, maybe carrot, definitely salt, real salt. You stopped a few feet away. Didn't speak, didn't ask, just stared. He looked up, met your eyes, said nothing. Then he nodded, just once. He scooped a ladleful into a dented tin cup and held it out. You didn't move at first, didn't trust it, didn't trust him. Then your knees buckled, and the decision was made for you. You took the cup, sat, held it with both hands like it might float away. It was hot. Your fingers stung, your lips burned, you drank anyway. And for a moment, just a moment, everything stopped. The shaking, the noise, the ache. It wasn't the best soup you'd ever had, but it was real, and it was offered, without price, without question. You looked at him. He just stared into the fire, stirring what remained. You wanted to speak, to say thank you, to ask what he'd traded to get those ingredients. But you didn't, because the silence was part of the gift. You sat there until the cup was empty, and your stomach stopped screaming. Then you handed it back. He didn't smile, didn't nod again, just poured another ladle for himself, and blew gently on the surface. That night you slept. Not well, but without pain gnawing your ribs. And when you woke, the wind felt less sharp. You looked for him the next day, to return the favor, to share whatever crumbs you could find. But he was gone, transferred, deserted, dead. No one could say. The pot was still there, empty. The fire long cold. Years later, you still remember that cup. The weight of it, the heat, the taste of salt, and something like hope. You've had feasts since then. Weddings, celebrations, bowls piled high with things you can now afford. But nothing ever tasted like that soup. Because that was the meal that saved your life. And no chef, no recipe, no banquet table can recreate what it means to be offered warmth when the world has gone cold. It started as a habit. The first few nights in camp, you took them off boots, unlaced soles, turned toward the fire, hoping they'd dry by morning. But they didn't. They froze, bent at the edges like broken hands. Took nearly an hour to thaw, just enough to wear again. Your toes ached for days. So one night, you kept them on, just until the fire died, just until you drifted off, just until the captain stopped pacing. But you woke the next morning and found yourself still wearing them. You stood, stretched, stamped twice to shake off the stiffness, and never took them off again. Not for sleep, not for dreams, not even when the blankets were dry and the air was still. Because part of you stopped trusting peace, stopped trusting stillness. You learned to sleep in pieces, one ear open, one leg ready to move, one hand near your pack. Your boots carried the dust of 7 provinces, the ash of burned villages, the blood of strangers. But more than that, they carried your fear. A fear so quiet, so constant you stopped noticing it. The fear of not being fast enough, of waking too late, of trying to lace trembling fingers through stiff leather while the horns blared and the world collapsed around you. So you slept with your shoes on. Every night, even when you had a cot, even when the fire was strong. Even when someone offered to watch your post, you smiled and nodded and still curled up with boots tight against your legs. You told yourself it was about speed, about safety. But deep down, it was something else, a vow. To never be caught unready again, to never be the one left behind. Once on a warmer night, you loosened the laces, just a little. You wanted to feel your feet breathe, to remember softness. But you dreamed of running, of falling, of trying to escape barefoot across gravel and thorns. You woke, gasping, and tightened the laces before the sun even rose. You watched others do the same. The ones who had marched longest, the ones who'd buried too many friends, the ones who never sat with their backs to the forest. You knew them not by rank, but by their boots. Always on, always scuffed, always ready. Eventually, no one questioned it. No one asked if your feet hurt, if your socks were damp, if the soles had split, because everyone understood. Shoes weren't just for walking, they were for surviving. Years later, long after the marches stopped, you tried sleeping barefoot in a real bed. White sheets, soft floor, windows that closed. But you tossed all night. Your feet twitched, your calves ached. In the morning you got dressed, sat on the edge of the bed, tied your boots, and exhaled. You wrote it when the frost was thick on the canvas, hands shaking, ink freezing in the nib, breath clouding over each word like it wanted to keep them secret. It wasn't long. You didn't know what to say. You started with, "I'm still alive," then scratched it out. Wrote it's cold here. Scratch that out, too. In the end, you said, I think of you when the wind blows from the west. I don't know why. Maybe that's where home is. You folded the paper carefully. Twice, once more, tucked it inside the corner of your coat, next to your ribs, where your heartbeat might keep it warm. You waited 3 days before the courier came, a boy with thin arms and mud up to his knees. He took the note without reading, tied it into a bundle of others. You watched him go. The snow fell again that night. You told yourself it wouldn't take long, a few weeks maybe, less if the bridges held. You waited, not every hour, not like a child at a window. But your ears perked when horses approached. Your eyes lingered when someone held a scrap of folded paper. You didn't say anything, didn't ask, just waited. Then you waited longer. Winter turned. Snow became mud. Mud became dust. Still, nothing came. One night, a man read his letter aloud, news from his wife, a name written in shaky script. Another kissed a folded paper and hid it in his boot. You smiled for them, genuinely, but your ribs ached. Eventually, the courier came back. You asked softly, as if the answer didn't matter. He blinked, shook his head, said the village had burned, or maybe been evacuated. He wasn't sure. The letter hadn't been returned. It had just disappeared. You nodded, thanked him, turned away before your face could give anything away. That night, you dreamed of the letter fluttering through smoke, landing in snow, resting in the pocket of a coat that no one ever wore again. You never wrote another, not because you stopped caring, but because you couldn't bear to hear silence twice. Sometimes you imagine someone found it, not the person you wrote to, just someone. A stranger, a child, a tired old man sorting through ash. You hope they read it. And you hope just for a second they believed it was meant for them, because maybe all letters are. Maybe every word we write in war is a prayer, not to be answered, just to be heard. You saw it first at the edge of the field. Still as a stone, brown fur caked with mud, ears twitching with each breeze. At first, you thought it was a trick, a branch a shadow, something left behind in the rain. But it moved, just barely, enough to reveal the rise and fall of its breath, enough to see the way its eyes tracked you. It sat beside a body, the body of a young man too small for the uniform, too still for this side of the line. Someone had covered his face with a coat. The dog rested its paw on the man's shoulder, as if keeping him from drifting away. You didn't go closer, not out of fear. Out of respect. There's something sacred about the things that don't leave. Even when everything else does. You watched as others passed a cart creaking through mud, soldiers whispering orders, a pair of boots too loud in the silence. None of them disturbed the dog. They gave it space. Like a gravestone with fur. That night, you asked the cook if he'd seen it. He nodded, said the dog had been there since morning. Maybe longer. No collar, no bark. Just presence. You brought it scraps the next evening, left them a few feet away. It didn't move. Didn't eat. Just blinked. Slowly. Once. You returned every day, always at dusk, always quiet. Sometimes you sat on a nearby stump and let the silence stretch between you. It never growled, never wagged its tail, never slept, only watched. Not the horizon, not the sky. Just the man beneath the coat. On the fourth night, you brought water. This time, it stood. walked a few paces, lapped twice, then returned to the body, to its place, as if its duty wasn't hunger or thirst, but waiting. The body was never buried. There were too many. The captain said there wasn't time. But the dog didn't care. It made its own ritual, its own vigil, and somehow that was enough. When the rains came, it stayed. When the wind screamed through the valley, it stayed. When the living gave up, remembering it stayed. You left camp 2 weeks later. You looked back. It was still there. Still waiting. Still loyal. Still holding space for a boy no one named. The first time you heard it, you thought it was a bird. A sharp call, sudden and high, slicing through the stillness like something startled. But then it came again. Short, snapped, followed by a wheeze, half-breath, half-broken tune. Laughter. From a man seated beside the latrine trench, back to the fire, face to the dark. He laughed like he'd heard the funniest joke in the world, and no one else had caught the punchline. You stared. So did others. No one spoke. Because laughter here was rare, too rare to be trusted. He kept doing it, not all the time, just after sunset. When the camp quieted, when the cold crept in, when the day's smoke settled low, he'd take his place, always the same spot, and let out that sound again. Hi, quick, empty. Some said he was mad. Others said he was remembering something. A story from home, a girl with a crooked smile, a cat that chased the wrong chicken. No one knew. One night, someone asked him, "What's so funny?" He turned slowly, eyes glassy, but not unkind, and said, "The sky still shows up." Then he laughed again, louder this time, like the stars were in on the joke. You didn't laugh, but you understood. Because, in a world of broken boots and rotting meat and maps that changed faster than names, something always returning was ridiculous. And somehow beautiful. You started listening for him each night. Not always close, sometimes just from your cot, sometimes through canvas and wind. A laugh, sharp as a flint strike, then gone. Once he didn't laugh for 3 nights. People noticed, no one said it aloud. Then on the 4th, just as someone had started to whisper, "Maybe he's gone," the laugh came again, shorter, softer. But real. You exhaled, so did the cook. Even the priest smiled into his tea. He became a kind of clock. When he laughed, you knew the day had ended, that you were still alive, that absurdity still had space among blood and ash. You never asked his name. He never asked yours. But once, as you passed by his spot on the 5th night of frost, you dropped a half-frozen apple near his boot. He didn't look up, just said it's funnier if you don't explain it. You didn't answer, just walked on, smiling. And behind you, the laugh came again. He was still in uniform. Still standing watch, at the same post, just outside the ruins of an old farmhouse, long since burned, long since emptied. His boots were clean. Not polished, just untouched, as if time had skipped over him like a missed step in a march. You found him by accident. Your unit had been rerouted chasing rumors of movement across the valley. You were tired, hungry, ready to stop. And then there he was, a figure beside the wall rifle, slung low, eyes fixed on nothing. You thought he might be a ghost. You approached slowly. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, just looked at you with calm, level eyes. You asked him his name. He gave it, clear, precise, as if he'd been practicing. You asked who he was waiting for. He said, relief. You asked how long he'd been there. He said since the last order. You checked the date on his passbook. It was 4 years out of date. You told him the war was over. He blinked once, then said, not here. You didn't argue, because what could you say to someone who'd built a world out of duty? A world with rules, borders, and days that never moved forward. You offered food. He declined. Said he was rationing. You offered to walk him back to camp. He shook his head. Said he hadn't been relieved yet. Said the line must be held. You tried again. Told him the names had changed. Told him the flags were different now. He looked past you toward the ridge and said, I haven't heard the horn. That night you stayed nearby, not to guard him, not to arrest him. Just to be close. He stood the entire night. Didn't sleep, didn't speak. When morning came, he took off his cap, held it to his chest, faced the sunrise, and said for the fallen. Then he put the cap back on and resumed his watch. You left him there. Not because you didn't care, but because some wars don't end when the treaties are signed. Some soldiers are still waiting for someone to say, you may rest now. And until then, they stand. It looked like any other field, tall grass golden near the top, bending gently in the wind. Soft hills, no craters, no bones, no crosses. But something about it made people quiet. You noticed it first, when the man beside you, the one who never stopped talking, fell silent as soon as his boots touched the edge. You glanced at him. He didn't look back, just kept walking, lips pressed tight. And then you looked around. No one spoke. Not the officers, not the green recruits, not the cook humming to himself out of habit. Even the horses moved with softer steps. The field swallowed sound. Not like a church that's too clean. Not like a grave that's too final. More like a held breath. You didn't ask why. Not then, but you felt it. In your skin, in your ribs, in the way the air thickened around your tongue, making words feel heavier than they were worth. It wasn't a rule. No one had posted signs. But everyone knew. This was the field where you didn't speak. Not even to say hello, not even to whisper a prayer. You just passed through. Eyes forward, steps careful, mouth closed. One night, you asked an older man when the fire had burned low and the stars felt honest. He said they used to bury them there, without markers. You nodded. He added, too many, too fast. Then he looked into the flames and said no more. The next time you crossed the field, you noticed the ground was uneven. Not obvious, but enough. Gentle mounds where the grass grew thicker, hollows where it wouldn't grow at all. You counted them once. Stopped halfway, not out of fear, out of respect. The silence wasn't absence, it was presence. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but insists on it anyway. You started to leave small things when you passed. A button, a pebble, a folded scrap of cloth. Others did too. Never much, just tokens, weightless things made heavy by the act of leaving. And no one ever touched what someone else left. That was another unspoken rule. You crossed that field a dozen times during the war, maybe more. And each time you didn't speak, didn't think, didn't breathe too loud. You just walked, letting the grass brush your knees, letting the silence fill the cracks you hadn't noticed in yourself. Years later, someone asked if you believed in sacred ground. You didn't answer with words. You just remembered that field and nodded. You saw her just as you turned the corner of a narrow street. The town had fallen days ago. No more gunfire, no more flags, just broken shutters and echoing footsteps. You weren't looking for anything, only passing through. The house looked like all the others' gray stone roof, half missing smoke still curling from somewhere unseen. But then you saw her. A small face in a high window, round cheeks, dark eyes, hair tied with something red. She didn't blink, just stared. Not afraid, not smiling, just watching. You stopped mid-step. So did the man behind you. He followed your gaze, squinted, and whispered, "Child." But neither of you called out. Something about the way she held the window frame, fingers barely curled around the edge, told you not to. She wasn't waving, she wasn't hiding, she was simply present, like a portrait someone forgot to take down. You kept walking, not because you wanted to, but because the road moved forward, and war doesn't linger where nothing burns. But that night, you thought of her, eyes like wells, mouth set like someone older. And you wondered, had she always been there? Did she live in that house? Or had she wandered in, found the highest room, and waited? For what? For someone to come back, for someone to knock for silence. You passed through that town again weeks later. Different route, different mission. You looked up. The window was empty. Shutters flapped in the wind. The red ribbon was gone. You asked around gently, carefully. No one knew her, or no one said. Maybe she was a shadow, or a ghost, or just a child who had learned too early how not to be seen. But you never forgot her. Because in that moment, between fire and ash boots and maps, she reminded you, someone is always watching, not to judge, not to tell, just to remember. And sometimes that's all we need. You didn't mean to do it. It was just a quiet moment, dusk falling, camp slowing the air heavy with wood smoke and weariness. You were holding your knife, not for battle, just cleaning mud from the grooves along the handle. Then your hands started moving, not like before, not with purpose, not with threat. With memory. They twisted the blade gently, set it aside, pulled a small stick from the firewood pile, and began to carve. You weren't thinking, you weren't trying, but a shape formed, rounded edge, curved nose, a little tail. You blinked. A horse. Not perfect, not pretty, but there it was, like the ones you used to carve as a child, as gifts, as toys, as prayers sometimes before long journeys. You stared at it, at your hands, at the curl of shavings in your lap. And for a moment, the war fell away. You remembered the sound of your father's knife on wood, the rhythm of his breath, the way he'd nod silently when you got it right. You hadn't thought of him in weeks, maybe months, but your hands had. They'd held on, through mud, through frost, through pain. They remembered what your mind had buried. They remembered before you did. The next day you found yourself tying knots the way your grandmother once taught you tight, and slanted good for rain. You hadn't done that in years, didn't even know you still could. But your fingers knew, your wrists knew, your skin remembered the motion even when the name escaped you. At night you rolled the wooden horse between your palms, not like a weapon, like a reminder that somewhere beneath the soldier, beneath the number, the weight, the routine, a self remained. Quiet, steady, waiting. You gave the horse to a boy who couldn't stop crying. He didn't say thank you, just held it close. And that was enough. The next evening, your hands carved another, then another. No one asked why. No one laughed. They just watched like they were remembering too. Because sometimes the body keeps truths the heart forgets. And in your hands, you found a map back to yourself. He never waited for orders. He just rose before the sky began to pale, pulled on his coat, and walked to the edge of camp where the ground was softest. That's where the shovels were. That's where the silence stayed thick. That's where the dead had begun to outnumber the living. You noticed him one morning while others still snored. His shadow moved slow and steady even in fog. You didn't speak. Something about the work demanded quiet. He didn't mark the graves, didn't write names, just dug. 3 feet, sometimes 4. Long enough for one body, sometimes 2. He never rushed, but never lingered. And when the sun rose, he returned, washed his hands in the barrel, ate without comment. By noon, he looked like everyone else, tired, mud-caked, human. But something in his gaze stayed lowered, not in shame, but in reverence. No one had assigned him this task. There was no list, no duty schedule, no medal for quiet mercy. But every morning the graves were there, and every morning his boots bore the proof. Once you followed him, not close, just enough to see where he stopped. There was a row of stones, small ones, each with a notch scratched into the side. You counted 5. He added one more, pressed the stone into the earth, stepped back, and that was it. No prayer, no gesture, just the rhythm of a man doing what needed to be done when no one else would. Later, you asked him gently why he did it. He looked at you, eyes rimmed red, but steady. Said because someone has to, that was all. You didn't ask again, but from then on others joined. Not many, not every day, but sometimes 2 shovels moved instead of 1. Sometimes someone left a flower. A coin, a name whispered into cold soil. The captain never said anything, neither did the chaplain, because in war some rules are unwritten. And this one was carved into morning frost. Let the dead rest with dignity. Even if only one man remembers, even if he never says a word. It wasn't sudden, no sharp crack, no gasp, no echo that made you pause. Just a slow shift, like water freezing like ink fading from an old letter. You noticed it one morning when you said your own name aloud. It didn't sound like you remembered? Not quite. The vowels came out flatter, the cadence slower, the accent not yours, not theirs, just neutral. Like someone had sanded down the edges. You thought maybe your throat was dry. You drank water, cleared it, tried again. Same voice, but not the same. You started listening after that, to yourself, to the others. They all spoke differently now. Words clipped, phrases shortened, emotions stripped out like weight from a pack. Gone instead of, he didn't make it, north instead of where they burned the mill. No need for poetry in war, just direction, just outcome. Once you laughed, and even that sounded off. Hollow, too loud at the end, like a stranger trying on your joy. You began to speak less. Not out of fear, out of caution. Because every time your mouth opened, something unfamiliar came out. You asked a friend someone who'd known you before if they noticed. He tilted his head, said maybe, or maybe we all forgot how we used to sound. You didn't ask again. That night, you dreamed of your mother calling you for dinner. But even in the dream, her voice was off, mimicking yours flat and strained. You woke in silence, then whispered her name to the dark and winced. The sound was too sharp. You used to sing once. Not well, but with warmth. Now the melodies you remembered felt foreign in your mouth. Your voice cracked where it once held, and somewhere in the second verse you stopped. Let the silence cover the notes. Let the new voice return. It was easier, more useful, less dangerous. Because the old voice belonged to someone who hadn't seen what you'd seen. And out here, you couldn't afford to sound like them anymore. It started with a smell. Not sharp, not sweet, just old. The scent of wet earth and burnt wood of moss pulling breath from the roots of things. You looked up, clouds low and wide, the kind that don't warn you, just open. And then it came, rain. Not the first of the season, not the kind that floods, just steady, soft, patient. You didn't run, didn't cover your head. You let it touch your hair, your shoulders, your hands. The first drop hit your cheek like a memory. The second, like a voice. By the third, you remember the orchard, the one behind your grandfather's house, where the pears grew heavy and the mud stuck to your heels when you tried to climb. You hadn't thought of it in years, but the rain had. The rain knew the path your feet once took in bare skin, the creak of the fence, the song your cousin sang as you sat on a low branch carving names into bark. It remembered. It always had. You turned in a slow circle, letting the drops gather. On your nose, your lashes, the line of your jaw, and suddenly the war didn't matter. Not the maps, not the boots, not the man who screamed last night, because the rain had seen it all before. 1,000 wars, 100 marches, dozens of boys like you who tried to carry too much and say too little. You knelt. Not in prayer, in recognition. That you weren't the first to feel hollow, that the ground had held weeping before, that the sky had washed blood from stones and still chosen to fall again. Someone passed you emetic boots slick with mud. He didn't speak, just touched your shoulder as he moved by. And for a moment you were both children, both soaked, both aching, both forgiven. You stayed there for a long time, letting the water find every scar, every forgotten crease, every closed place inside you, because the rain wasn't asking you to remember. It was remembering for you, and somehow that was enough. You first heard the tapping at dawn, a soft, rhythmic knock, not metal, not urgent, but steady. Like a heartbeat in wood. He sat near the edge of the tent line on a low crate with a hammer no bigger than your palm, and hands stained the color of old leather. Boots were piled beside him, tall ones, short ones, torn, split, surrendered. He picked them up one at a time, turned them over like he was reading their story, then began to sew patch-shaped press. He didn't speak. Not to the officers, not to the men who dropped boots in his lap with a grunt and a nod, not to the wind, only to the shoes. You watched him for a long time before approaching. Your own soles had split a slow betrayal that left your toes wet even in dry weather. He took them without comment, ran his fingers along the seam, then looked up at you and said the only thing you ever heard from him: "Sit." You did. He worked with movements like breath unthinking, natural true. You saw him use a piece of bone as a spacer, a fishhook as a thread puller, a scrap of old saddle as new heel. Nothing wasted. Everything returned. When he handed your boots back, they looked the same, but felt different. Lighter, wiser. You said thank you. He nodded once, then reached for the next pair. No coins exchanged, no promises. Just repair. You learned his story in pieces. That he was never meant for war. That he had a shop in a town that no longer stood. That he'd come looking for someone, a brother, a son, a friend, depending on who told it. But when he found the army, they gave him a hammer instead of a rifle. And he stayed. Through snow, through retreat, through silence. Because someone had to keep you walking. The officers called him the cobbler. The young ones called him old hands. But you just called him the man who made the path possible. Once you saw him stop, in the middle of a stitch, he held the boot against his chest, eyes closed. You thought maybe he was tired, but later someone said that pair had belonged to a boy who didn't return. And maybe, just maybe, he'd recognized the way the leather bent. You left him a piece of wax once. He used it, said nothing. But the next time you came by, your boots were lined with wool. He had found a way to care in silence, and in every thread, every nail, every tap of his tiny hammer, he reminded you that survival isn't always in the fight. Sometimes it's in the walking. It was already there when you arrived, folded, frayed at the edges, faintly damp like it had been pulled from the bottom of a bag no one had opened in months. You were too cold to ask whose it was. You'd just come off a night march, knees stiff, boots heavy with frozen mud, lungs full of fog. The tent was full. No spare bedding, just this blanket. You reached for it slowly, expecting someone to stop you. A voice, a look, a hand on your wrist. Nothing. So you took it, laid it across your legs, first testing, then your chest. Then you curled into it like it had always been yours. It didn't smell like you. It smelled like smoke, like old wool, like someone who used mint leaves to wash and never quite got rid of the dirt. You slept hard. When you woke, the snow had started again, and no one asked where the blanket had come from. That was the rule. If it kept you warm, you didn't question it. You carried it for weeks. Folded it tight in your pack, unfurled it each night like a ritual, creased it carefully in the morning, brushing off leaves or ash or crumbs. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, you held it close and imagined the person it used to belong to. A name, a voice, hands that stitched that torn corner where the threads crossed unevenly like a child's first attempt. You never found out. But you felt them, in the weight of the fabric, in the way it seemed to fit you perfectly despite the mismatched edges. The blanket was not yours, but it was not stolen either. It was shared, passed like a whisper from one cold body to the next. From someone who no longer needed it to someone who still did. Once in a different camp, you laid it beside another soldier whose coat had burned through. He didn't thank you, just pulled it close and slept for the first time in 2 days. You moved on the next morning, and the blanket didn't come with you. You missed it for weeks, not just the warmth, the feeling that someone else somewhere had made room for you, but you didn't take it back. because it was never yours. It was something better. A kindness that had simply stopped in your hands for a while. He was already pale when they carried him in. Blanket over his chest, mud on his boots, one hand clutching his side where the blood bloomed dark and warm. He didn't scream, didn't even groan. Just stared up at the canvas ceiling like he was reading something written in smoke. You were on duty, not as a medic, just as a witness. Holding water, pressing gauze, counting breaths. At some point, his eyes found yours. He whispered, paper. You didn't ask why. You just gave him a scrap torn from the corner of a ration box. He took it with shaking fingers, asked for a pencil, then drew. Lines, curves, a circle, a small X. No words, no legend, just motion. You watched his hand move with purpose even as his chest grew slower, even as the medic whispered to you he won't make it through the hour. Still he drew, as if the ink were holding him here, as if the map mattered more than the blood beneath it. When he finished, he folded the paper once, pressed it into your palm, and said, "Don't go left at the split. The river lies." Then he closed his eyes. You kept the paper. Didn't know what it meant. Didn't know where the split was, or if the river was real, or if it was all just fever and memory. But you kept it dry, flat, safe. 2 weeks later, you reached a place that looked familiar, even though you'd never seen it before. The trees leaned the same way. The air felt too quiet, and there it was, a fork in the trail. One path wide and easy, the other narrow, swallowed in moss. The captain said left. You said wait, and showed the map. He laughed at first, then paused, then sent 2 scouts. They didn't return. Later that night, the captain asked where you got it. You just said from someone who didn't have time to explain. You still carry that scrap, faded now, edges curled. But it remains. Because sometimes the clearest directions come from those closest to the end. And sometimes a dying man sees further than any general ever could. You didn't recognize it at first. Just a mound, low, sunken slightly, like someone had once tried to hide it, but gave up halfway. There was a marker, rough stone. No carving, just a smear of soot and a strip of cloth tied to a twig. You stepped around it, then stopped, because something pulled you back. A shape, a feeling, a wrongness that didn't feel wrong enough. You crouched, brushed away a layer of frost. Beneath the stone, someone had etched 3 letters. Your initials. Not your full name. Not clear, but enough. Enough to make your mouth go dry. You looked around. The path was empty. No one else had noticed. The grave was shallow. Old, maybe, or meant to be temporary. A mistake, a warning, a coincidence. You reached out and touched the edge of the stone. It was cold, rough, real. You sat there for a long time, not afraid, not even surprised. Just quiet. Because deep down, some part of you always knew you might leave without a word. That the world might go on and you'd be a story someone half remembered. A soldier with a soft step. A boy with tired hands. Gone. And here, it was proof that maybe, just maybe, that had already happened. Maybe someone thought you'd fallen in the river. Maybe someone buried the wrong body. Maybe someone needed a place to mourn, and your name was the only one they could bear to give. You never found out, never asked. But you didn't touch the marker again. You stood. breathed in the cold, and kept walking. Not because the grave wasn't yours, but because you weren't finished yet. There was no horn, no banner, no man on horseback shouting victory, just silence. It came slowly, like fog lifting from the tips of trees, a stillness too wide to trust, too soft to feel real. At first, you thought it was a trap. The enemy had pulled back before, lured you into valleys, into rivers, into wrong turns that ended in names lost and fires rising. So you waited. Boots laced, pack ready, one hand always near the strap of your blade. But the wind stayed gentle. The birds returned, and no one gave orders. Not for a day, then 2, then 5. Someone asked, did they forget us? Another muttered, maybe we're the last ones still fighting. You wanted to laugh, but your throat ached, not from cold, from emptiness. You checked the ridgelines. No scouts, no flags. You asked a passing rider. He shrugged, said the capital had changed hands 3 weeks ago, said papers were being signed. Then he rode off, just like that. No parade, no salute, no word for the men still camped in the forest, waiting to hear they were allowed to rest. You looked at your hands. They didn't know what to do. No wood to chop, no boots to patch, no grave to dig, no letter to fear. The war was over, and somehow no one told you. You watched others come to terms slowly. One man wept, another built a fire too large and stared into it like it owed him answers. The captain sat for hours, helmet in his lap, unmoving. You sat too, not thinking, just breathing, and that's when you noticed the birdsong again. A sound you hadn't heard in months, or maybe you had, but hadn't listened. It was gentle, high, repeating. Not a celebration, just life returning. One thread at a time. Someone asked what you would do next. You didn't answer, because peace wasn't loud. It wasn't certain. It was just there, like a letter slipped under a door. Like snow melting without being seen, like silence that didn't hurt. You whispered to yourself, it's over. And still, part of you didn't believe it. Because some wars don't end when the paper says so. They end when your body finally unclenches. When your breath stops mimicking orders. When you sleep, really sleep for the first time without your boots on. And that would take time. It was already burning when you arrived. No one stood near it. No hands outstretched. No kettle balanced on the stones. Just flames, low steady, flickering in the soft hush of evening. You didn't question it. After days of wet boots and colder nights, your body moved before your thoughts. You sat close, close enough to feel it on your cheeks, close enough to believe it. You held your palms out, not too close as if it might vanish if you asked too much. Others joined you, one by one, no words, no glances. Just boots and mud, breath hanging in the air, a circle forming around something that should not have been there. No one brought wood, no one stoked it, but it did not dim. And in that moment, it didn't matter if the fire was real, because your fingers stopped trembling, because someone leaned against someone else, because silence finally softened. You remember watching the flames dance the way they curved in shapes that looked like stories, like home, like the sound of someone saying your name when you were still whole. You closed your eyes, and in the glow behind your lids, you saw an orange scarf, a chipped bowl, a porch light that used to wait for you. When you opened them, the fire was still there. Still unclaimed, still alive. Someone placed a pot nearby, empty but hopeful. Steam didn't rise, but no one cared, because sometimes the body needs belief more than proof. Because sometimes warmth is a memory you hold in both hands and pretend it still burns. That night you slept beside the flames. No tent, no boots, just dirt and sky and a heat you didn't deserve but needed anyway. When you woke at dawn, the fire was gone. No smoke, no coals, no trace. Only footprints, pressed into the frost, leading away in quiet directions. You never spoke of it. No one did. But from that night on, you carried a spark. Not in your hands. In your heart. Small, flickering, enough. Because even a fire that no one lit can keep you alive, if you let it. You didn't notice the ring at first. Her hands were always dirty, stained with soot, lined with calluses from lifting tying mending. But one night, under the soft flicker of lantern light, she reached across the fire to pass you a piece of bread, and it caught the glint. Silver, thin, plain, so worn it almost disappeared into her skin. She didn't hide it, but she never mentioned it either. You didn't ask, because some things are not spoken about out loud. Not in war, not at night, not when they're the only thing keeping someone tethered to what they once were. She moved like someone with purpose, the way people do when they've already promised something or someone they'd come back. She stitched torn sleeves, tended burns, stood her turn at watch even when her breath shook, and always the ring was there. A circle of quiet defiance. Others noticed too. Once someone joked he must be some man to have a woman like that still waiting. She didn't laugh, didn't scowl. Just said he isn't waiting, and went back to scraping a pan clean with a piece of bark. That was the last time anyone mentioned it, but the ring stayed. Through winter frost, through retreat, through long nights where no one spoke and even the stars felt too far away. You watched her once when she thought no one was looking. She twisted the ring slowly, gently around her finger, 3 times, always 3. Then kissed it, not like a ritual, not like superstition, like remembering how to breathe. You asked her much later, when the sky had turned to spring and her hair had gone whiter at the edges, if it still fit. She held up her hand. It never came off, she said, even when I wanted it to. You didn't press, because you understood that the ring wasn't a reminder of love. It was a scar worn on the outside. A wound that no longer bled but still ached with the weather. When she died, no one removed it. Not out of reverence, out of recognition that it belonged with her. And maybe, just maybe, he was still out there somewhere, wearing one too. At first, it was practical. Less speaking meant less attention, less risk, fewer mistakes. You learned to gesture, to nod, to grunt once for yes, twice for no. You let others fill the air with words, stories, curses, songs. And you stayed quiet. It wasn't hard. The war taught you that silence wasn't just safety, it was survival. When you did speak, it was clipped, dry, functional. North, gone, hold, no one asked you to say more. Eventually, even your dreams grew quieter. No voices, just wind or the crack of boots against frost. You forgot you used to sing to yourself on cold mornings, forgot the way your voice cracked when you laughed too hard. You forgot what it felt like to speak for no reason. And one day you realized you didn't know what you sounded like anymore. It happened in a clearing when someone asked your name. You opened your mouth and hesitated. The word was there, the shape of it, but not the weight, not the music. You said it anyway, soft, uncertain. It felt wrong in your throat, foreign, like something borrowed or stolen. You didn't say anything else that day, or the day after. But later, much later after the noise had stopped, and the fires had gone cold and someone handed you a warm drink without asking anything at all, you whispered a word. Not a name, not a command, just a word you used to like. It felt rough, but real. You said it again, then another. And another, and slowly your voice came back. Not all at once, not as it was, but like a song half remembered. A hum beneath your breath, a murmur in the trees. It cracked. It wavered, but it was yours. And after all that silence, that was enough. It was just a path at first, worn earth, cart tracks, pebbles pressed into clay. You didn't question it. Roads were made to be followed, and so you walked. But something was different. Every time you looked back, the road behind you had changed. A turn that hadn't been there, a stone you didn't remember stepping over, grass growing where there had been ash. At first you blamed exhaustion, blamed memory, blamed fog. But the feeling stayed, that the road was not still, that it shifted subtly, silently with every step you took. You asked someone once, "Are we walking in circles?" He shook his head, said no, but the land doesn't stay put. You laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like something only a tired man would believe. But over time, you stopped marking trees, stopped counting bends, because the markers moved. The bends returned, and no matter how far you went, you never seemed closer to anywhere. Still, you walked, not because you trusted the road, but because you didn't know how to stop. Once you stayed in one place for 3 days, built a fire, washed your socks, let the silence catch up to you. When you stood to leave, the road was gone. A field had taken its place, flat, empty. And in the distance, a new path curving just slightly to the left. You followed it. Not because you believed it would end, but because not walking felt heavier than walking. Eventually, you stopped asking where it led. You stopped believing in destinations. The road had become the world. And you had become the road. It didn't fit. Not really. One sleeve too short, one shoulder too wide. The hem uneven slanted, like it had given up halfway through becoming whole. But it kept the wind out. Mostly, the left side was made of dark wool, coarse itchishichi stubborn. The right, something lighter, almost silk torn at the cuff. The back strips of canvas frayed and faded, stitched together with thread so thick it made lines like scars. You didn't ask who had sewn it. Someone in the camp. Someone with steady hands and no more patience for waste. You were given it after your last shirt tore too wide to hide the bruises beneath. It'll do, they said, and it did. You wore it in rain, in snow, on days when the sun was strong enough to sting your skin, and on nights when you slept beside the fire and dreamed of cities you hadn't seen. The seams rubbed, the threads itched. But you wore it, because it stayed together. Even when you didn't, Over time, you began to notice the stories. A name stitched into the collar faded to a single letter. A button, sewn with red thread, the only one that didn't match. A patch under the arm, shaped like a heart but unintentional. You began to wonder about the lives these fabrics had lived before becoming yours. Who had sweated into the wool? Who had danced in the silk? Who had bled on the canvas? You didn't know. But you felt them like echoes, like ghosts. And somehow, that made you stand taller. Because you weren't wearing a shirt. You were wearing survival. Three kinds, three people, all stitched into one body that still had somewhere to go. The shirt never softened, never truly became yours. But you wore it until the cuffs tore again, until the buttons cracked, until it finally gave out in the middle of a crossing when the river pulled too hard. You left it behind on a branch, hung it like a flag, not in surrender, in remembrance for all the pieces of others that had carried you this far. No stone, no wood, no cross, just ash. They gathered it from the edge of the fire, still warm, still soft, and shaped it carefully on a flat slab of rock. 4 letters, not the full name, just enough. Just enough to say, he was here, he mattered, he is gone. You didn't know who started it. Someone with black on their fingers, knees bent to the earth, heart still breaking. You watched from a distance. No one spoke, no one cried. They just stood, like trees, like shadows. You approached slowly. The name was already starting to smudge, a wind brushing over it like breath on glass. You wanted to ask, was that his real name? Was that what he wanted to be remembered by? But the truth is, you don't get to choose your final signature in war. Sometimes it's written in blood, sometimes in mud, and sometimes in ash. Someone added a line beneath the name, a single mark. No rank, no date. Just the line, like the echo of a name. You knelt beside them. The heat from the fire was still in the stone, still holding on, and you felt something in your chest pull tight. Because you remembered saying his name aloud, maybe once, maybe more, and now it was fading. The next morning, it was gone. Rain had come, washed the letters into the soil, carried them into the cracks between rocks. No one tried to rewrite it, because that wasn't the point. The name had been spoken, seen, held, even for just one night. And that was enough. You never slept in the same place twice. Not really. Even if the ground stayed still, the wind changed, the sky shifted, the silence rearranged itself. Your bed was a blanket, a coat, a patch of dry leaves, a hollow between stones. Sometimes just dirt warmed by a fading fire, but it moved with you. And some nights, it felt like it moved on its own. You'd lie down beneath a tree, watch the stars blink their slow rhythm, close your eyes, and wake somewhere else, not far. Just far enough that the shadows had changed. The smell of pine had become smoke, the whisper of reeds now a chorus of frogs. Your bed, it seemed, was always drifting, rolled gently by the wind. You tried once to anchor it, drew a circle of stones, set your pack as a pillow, tied a string around your wrist, and looped it to a stake. But still, the next morning, you were 3 steps from where you'd begun. No one saw you move. No one touched you. It was as if the earth itself had rocked you in your sleep like a mother with no voice, only breath. You didn't fight it after that. You stopped laying your head in the same direction, stopped caring which way your boots pointed, because the wind knew better than you where rest could be found. And when you surrendered to it, when you stopped trying to stay put, your sleep deepened. No dreams, just motion. A slow drift between worlds where nothing chased nothing waited, and nothing demanded you return. Sometimes you'd wake with a pebble in your palm, or a petal pressed to your cheek, gifts from the night. Proof that you had moved, and that something had moved with you. You never told anyone. Some things are better left between you and the wind. And your bed? Your bed was never truly yours anyway. It belonged to the road, to the turning seasons, to the breath of the world. You were only borrowing it, for now. He didn't speak much, just walked the camp, slow eyes, down hands in his coat. Not looking for trouble, just looking. At first you thought he was a scavenger, lost, maybe confused. But then you saw what he kept. Buttons. Not bullets, not knives, not rations. Buttons. He'd find them in the mud, in old coats tossed aside in the pockets of men too tired to notice what had fallen. Big ones, small ones. Wood-bone metal, some with thread still hanging on like memory that refused to let go. He didn't hoard them, didn't sell them, didn't wear them. He sorted them, laid them out at night, on a piece of cloth arranged by size, by color, by stories only he knew. Once you asked him why, he looked at you, not startled, not secretive, just patient, and said, "They're the last thing people leave behind." You didn't understand then. But over time, you began to notice too. When a coat was burned, the buttons survived. When a man was buried quickly, the buttons stayed in the mud. When the wind tore through tents, the buttons rolled to your feet like soft echoes. The man kept collecting, gently, carefully, with the reverence of someone handling names. You watched him one evening place a single brass button at the base of a tree. No words, no gesture. Just a breath and the sound of cloth folding over cloth. You asked who it was for. He said a boy who never learned to sew, and smiled faintly as if remembering a crooked stitch. After the war, no one saw him again. But in one pack, left behind beside a cold fire, there was a bundle wrapped in linen. Dozens of buttons, clean, polished, waiting. You took one, a small wooden disc with a crack down the middle. And you carry it still, not because it belonged to someone you knew, but because someone else believed it did. And sometimes, that's all a memory needs. It happened in the village where you were born, or maybe not born, but where your earliest memories lived. The bend in the road, the stone wall with moss in its cracks, the scent of boiled pears on cold mornings. You returned with a limp and a coat that wasn't yours. Not looking for recognition, just quiet. You stood outside the baker's house, watched the smoke rise, let the scent carry you back to a time when your name was spoken with softness. An old woman stepped outside, paused, looked at you. You nodded. She nodded back, but there was no flicker in her eyes, no pause of breath, no startled joy. She said, passing through, "And you said yes." Because you understood. Whatever parts of you had belonged here were gone now. Buried on roads you didn't name, carried away in shirts burned for warmth, left behind in the shape of letters never answered. Later, a child offered you water. Eyes wide, curious. You asked his name. He told you. You told him yours. He repeated it, slowly, then shook his head. No one with that name lives here. You smiled. Gently, not bitterly, because he was right. You don't live here anymore. Not really. You thanked him, drank the water, and left before the shadows stretched too long. That night, you stared into the mirror, a piece of metal bent smooth beside a campfire. The face there was yours, and not yours. Eyes too old, cheekbones carved from quiet, a mouth that forgot how to speak freely. You whispered your name. It sounded foreign, but you whispered it again anyway, because even if no one else remembers, you do, and for tonight, that's enough. You looked up one night after the rain had stopped. The clouds had torn open slowly, like curtains reluctantly parting, and there it was, the sky. Vast, dark, clear. You could see stars again. Tiny pinpricks scattered across an endless black blinking, like they had been watching all along. You lay back on the cold earth. No pillow, no blanket, just mud drying into your coat and a heartbeat pressed to dirt. You tried to count them. The stars. Got to 8. Lost track. Started again. Gave up. Because it wasn't about the number. It was about the silence. The kind that didn't come from death, but from distance. The sky hadn't changed. Not for the battles, not for the screaming, not for the maps that turned red with loss. You realized then it had never once looked down and flinched. The sky didn't mourn the cities, didn't weep for the names scratched into bark, didn't sigh for the bones buried without ceremony. It simply existed, endless, untouched, and in that there was something strangely comforting. That your pain didn't disturb the stars, that your memories didn't bend the moon, because it meant you could rest beneath something steady, something that didn't expect anything from you, something that stayed even when nothing else did. You closed your eyes, let the starlight trace your skin, soft as breath, indifferent, gentle. You were not important here, not special, not broken, just small. And for once that felt like freedom, because in the sky's silence, you found a kind of peace. The world would go on, and you didn't have to carry it. Not tonight. You didn't notice the stillness at first. It wasn't loud like the end of a storm. It didn't announce itself. It simply crept in through your boots, into your breath, between your bones. The march had ended, the war too, or at least that's what they said. But your feet still shifted when you stood still. Your hands still curled around tools you no longer needed, and your thoughts, they still wandered the roads you had already walked. For so long you had moved forward towards something, or away from something. You're not sure anymore. Now there's nowhere left to go, and that is where the wait begins. You thought peace would feel like light, like breath, like a coat you could finally take off. Instead, it feels like fog. Soft, uncertain, too quiet. You wake up early still, before the sun, before the birds, just in case. In case someone calls your name. In case orders arrive. In case the world decides it was only pausing. But the voice never comes. The horn never sounds. Just your heartbeat thudding like it used to when you were waiting for battle, but didn't know from which side it would come. Some nights you lie awake and name the ones who didn't return. Not aloud, just in your head, softly, like prayer, like inventory. You don't cry. Not because you don't miss them, but because grief no longer needs salt. It lives in your breath now, in your silence, in the way you set the cup down slower than you used to. You speak differently, slower, lower, more carefully. Because war taught you that words are weight, and you've carried enough. You laugh sometimes, when the wind catches a leaf, just right. When a child makes a face that reminds you of a boy who once believed in maps. But the laugh ends quickly, not out of shame, out of respect, because joy now is fragile. A porcelain cup, a thread. You hold it gently, never sure when it might slip. You thought you'd return to who you were. The voice, the walk, the gaze that didn't flinch. But the mirror tells another story. Your shoulders curve inward now, not from defeat, from carrying too many names, from leaning into storms you never chose. And your eyes, they've learned to look past things, to see what's missing, what's hidden, what's waiting in the silence between breaths. People ask what it was like. You want to tell them. You do. But how do you explain the way a hand once offered a piece of bread can become holy? How do you speak of the man who laughed only at night, the woman who never stopped waiting at the window, the grave with your own name on it? So you say what they want to hear. It was cold. It was long. I was lucky. And that's true, but not full. Because the truth lives in quieter places, like how your fingers still twitch when you hear boots in gravel, or how you save the last bite of bread even when there's more, just in case. You build a life, slowly. You learn to tend things, not control, just tend. Soil, fire, chickens, even laughter. You plant things not to feed yourself, but to remember that something still grows. And when you sleep, you no longer march. But you do walk, softly, through fields with no flags, toward doorways with no locks. Sometimes you stop and listen. Not for threats, not for orders, just for the wind. To remind yourself that not all things whisper danger, some just whisper. And now, you carry peace like a second skin. Not flashy, not pure, just stitched from what you salvaged. Moments, names, hands. You are not who you were. But you are still here, still walking, still waking, and maybe, just maybe that's enough. You've been walking for so long now, through ashes, through snow, through the breathless silence between empires, and now you've stopped, just for a while. There's no one calling your name, no footsteps behind you, no order to follow. Only breath, only night, only stillness. You lie back, feel the earth beneath you, solid, ancient, unchanged. Above, stars blink like memories you've long forgotten. And in the distance, a wind stirs the grass soft as the voice of someone you once loved. You don't need to remember everything. You've carried enough. The names, the footsteps, the fires, the graves, let them rest now. The war may be over, but the story is still yours. In every quiet heartbeat, in every path that leads nowhere, in every piece of peace you let yourself feel. So breathe, let go, let sleep take what the world could not. You're safe now. You're home, and you're not walking anymore. Not tonight.